My theme today, based on my own suggestion, is Cuban democracy and the 21st century Latin American left. Now, some of you may be thinking, well, what does Cuba have to do with 21st century Latin American left? After all, the Cuban Revolution took place in the second half of the 20th century, a long time ago, and most of the life of the Cuban Revolution was in the 20th century. Others may also be asking, well, is Cuba a democracy? There's only one party. So my main message here today is I'm going to ask you to reflect on a certain political point. I'm not trying to convince anyone, but I think that it's worthwhile reflecting on the following. In my view, regarding political systems, the dichotomy is not between, on the one hand, how many parties exist in a political system, and on the other hand, a so-called one-party system. My view is the following. There is a dichotomy in political systems, considering Latin America, United States, and Europe, and that dichotomy is the following. Whether a political system fosters the notion that sovereignty lies in the hands of the people, or a political system that excludes that possibility, that does not accept that notion that sovereignty should be in the hands of the people. So based on this, I think that Cuba is very much part of the 21st century new Latin American left. I don't want to, I could, defeat any arguments against it very easily by saying, well, if it wasn't for the Cuban Revolution, this whole new movement in the 21st century, I don't think it would have been able to take place, but that would be too easy. It's not the point. I just want people to think about how we categorize political systems in this 21st century. Now, as you know, let's say, well, just dealing further on this issue of false dichotomy, for example, Venezuela is a political system now with the Bolivarian revolution at the helm up to now, which definitely fosters sovereignty being vested in the people. It's an ongoing daily process. It's not perfect, but that is definitely the goal, and it takes place to a large extent at this time. But I would add, and it has several political parties there, right? But I will ask you to reflect on the following worst case scenario. What if the Bolivarian revolution would have lost the election on April 14th, and the White House candidate, Capriles, would have won the election? Then the whole scenario changed. It is no longer a political system which fosters the notion that sovereignty should be vested in the hands of the people. After all, the United States Constitution, when the United States was born at the end of the 18th century, the very basis of the U.S. political process is the exclusion of the people, never wanting to recognize that sovereignty be vested in the people. Complete exclusion. So in that worst case scenario, how would you characterize Venezuela if Capriles would have won the election, or say in 4 or 5 years down the line, which is possible. We don't want that to happen, but it's possible. So that's why I don't think that this is a way to have, to characterize political system based on the number of political parties. Now, Cuba has one political party, but I don't agree with the notion that Cuba is a one-party system. Cuba political system, its main feature is struggling right from the beginning to strive, I say strive because I know it's not perfect, strive to have sovereignty being vested in the hands of the people. And in the case of Cuba, my investigation has shown, and I've detailed this in my latest book, that this tradition of Cuba, of vesting sovereignty in the hands of the people, people's participation on a daily basis, that goes all the way back to the 19th century struggles for independence by the Cuban people against Spain, where they had 4 constitutions, constituent assemblies, people voted, etc. So that is their history. Now, at this time, so I don't think it's a one-party state. In fact, it says, of course it says here that the Communist Party of Cuba in their constitution is a follower of Marty's idea and as the organized vanguard of the Cuban nation. By the way, it's no longer an organized vanguard of the working class. This constitution has been reformed several times since 1976. So it is an organized vanguard of the Cuban nation. That's one article. But another article says, in the Republic of Cuba, sovereignty lies in the people from whom originates all the powers of the state. Is there a contradiction in this? I personally do not think so. Let's give some recent examples. Now, Cuba, as everyone knows, we don't have to go into detail, is going through major changes, whatever word you want to use, updating its social system, changes, reform. They're going through major changes over the last few years. For example, promoting self-employed workers. In the country, in the city, for the first time, you're also having cooperatives. And there are many other examples of how the past negative influence on the economic front of the Soviet Union and having a top-heavy state, that this is being changed so the political and economic system is increasingly decentralized. And based on that, what I'd like to highlight today is not so much these economic changes, but how Cuba, in a country which its overall orientation is sovereignty being vested in the people, how do they deal with these changes? And you'll see, I believe that the issue of how many parties is not really the issue. For example, in 2007, Raúl Castro gave an important appeal in a speech in July of that year, knowing full well, because the Cuban leadership is not immune from the groundswell of complaints and problems and suggestions that come from the people to the upper levels of the society, called on the people to have an open discussion. Okay, put it on the table. What are the issues? What do you think that should be done, etc.? And that actually took place on a very wide scale. And after his speech, there was 5.1 million people participated in neighborhood and workplace meetings, coming up with approximately over 3,500 different suggestions of what to do. And that included a lot of things. Anyone who knows Cuba, it is far from being the US media image of a closed communist society. People are afraid to talk and all that. It's very opinionated. In that sense, it's very similar to Venezuela. Very, very opinionated. And then after that, in preparation for the Communist Party Congress in April 2011, which really was the cornerstone of this whole new movement to update the socialist economy there, you had another vast discussion taking place for several months in the workplaces and the neighborhood, and the original guidelines that were suggested by the leaders, over 67% of those guidelines were completely changed or amended by the people from the base, from the grassroots. In fact, some of the guidelines, for example, we'll take one of the most famous ones, the right to buy and sell cars. In the initial guidelines proposed by the party, that was not there. However, because of these discussions, that new guideline found itself in the party congress and it was approved, and only a few months after its approval, which was not suggested by the leadership, there was legislation enacted almost immediately to allow the buying and selling of cars. And what I find of interest now, and I concentrate a lot of this in my book, that Cuba now, in my view, is a country where we find a large amount of serious debate, discussion, and controversy amongst the people on how to move forward. And in my book, I open my pages to several Cuban social scientists. For example, Olga Fernandez Rios. She, in articles regarding this whole period I'm discussing, she says what happened in 2007 and 2010, 2011, these discussions at the base in the neighborhood, that this should be a permanent thing. It should not be like a one-shot deal. It's an important Congress, people have to get here, have to decide, but it has to be done on a permanent basis. In other words, that the people should be involved continuously in being consulted and taking part in the main decision. And she goes even further, and she says that people should also get involved in proposing policies, not just approving or disapproving or commenting on policies being suggested by the leadership. So these are discussions and debates that are taking place within this so-called one-party system, which is really a system based on debate and controversy and differing opinions. And there are other people as well that I quote, but I'd like to deal with something that's more recent. We had the pleasure to participate just a few days ago in the LASA Congress, Steve and I, in the same, we assisted in that panel, in which two Cuban colleagues gave a very interesting presentation. They're here today. I'm very happy they're here today. And I translated one very short part of what they had to say here, which is a very good example of how the type of debate that's going on now in Cuba. What they say is the new ongoing, this is their section on Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador, how this influences Cuba. What they wrote is the following: the new ongoing processes in the region, this whole region, are characterized by a noticeable freshness, yet suffer from the lack of accumulated experience. That's okay. The Cubans have a rich accumulation of experience, but sometimes we may miss the freshness helpful in incorporating transformations in a flexible manner that these times require. Cuba is an example that models are not worthwhile. They go on to say, we start from the need to assess the real influences that the Cuban Revolution received from these ongoing processes, such as in Venezuela, Bolivia, and Ecuador. This should help to provide guidance that allows us to better mold the ideal of socialist society to which we aspire in Cuba, etc. So this is the type of discussion that is going on in Cuba. I just want to make one point so I don't forget in case I get the signal, is that in Cuba, with regards to opposition, that's one of my main things that I deal with over many years. In Cuba, if you have ideas, if you want to change things, there's lots of room for it. It just so happens in Cuba, concretely, the so-called opposition, I'm just based on my concrete study, the so-called opposition, whether it's left dissidents, which in my view are the worst and most dangerous, or the right dissidents, their basic common feature is regime change in Cuba. I go right back to the State Department policy, U.S. State Department policy in 1959, when they elaborate the position that we have to work on the following theme, that we need people, they said liberals, not conservatives, liberals who would say, well, the revolution was good, but the revolution was betrayed. We want something else, and we have to get rid of the Castros. So that's how the left and right opposition manifests itself concrete in Cuban conditions. In Venezuela, it might be somewhere elsewhere. In Bolivia, elsewhere. In Ecuador, elsewhere. But if you have opposition like Capriles, it's not such a positive thing for the political system. It's interesting to note that the so-called left dissidents in Cuba, who do they support in the elections in Venezuela? Believe it or not, they supported Capriles as a social democrat, reasonable person. If he got into power, you know, there would be more discussion in Venezuela. There won't be any authoritarianism by Chavez and all that. So you have to look at opposition in the historical concrete conditions of each country. So I only have about a couple of minutes. So I'm getting to the end anyways, but what I would like to say that Cuba is changing a lot, and the influence, I really was happy to hear in Washington, D.C., the Cuban comrades openly saying that they're interested in the freshness that comes from those new revolutionary processes in Latin America to help the older Cuban revolution to adapt to the current situation. There's some very serious examples of this right now. For example, Telesur, which is based, if I'm not mistaken, mainly in Caracas, but with collaboration of other countries such as Argentina, including Cuba, is being, you know, you can see it virtually 24 hours a day. I have satellite TV in Canada. That's an advantage of being Canadian. I think you're limited in that. I have satellite TV from Cuba, and there's one station that shows Telesur continuously. So even my closest Cuban colleagues say, hey, this is really provocative, because in Telesur, in some ways, is superior to the Cuban television. It's more lively. It's different. Of course, it has more resources than the Cuban television. So after saying all this, I hope that you realize that my suggestion to at least reflect upon the notion that political systems are not based on a false dichotomy between several parties on the one hand and so-called one party on the other. It's the question of rather sovereignty being held in the hands of the people, being fostered by the political system in question. And I hope that you would consider this as a new way of thinking about political systems. Thank you very much.
Thank you.